thought I'd kick off firstly with a bit of a reflection about graduate research and about what the PhD is all about. You will find that I talk a lot about the PhD. It's not to say that the Masters is not important, it's just really to recognise that in Australia, roughly 80% of our higher degree research training is actually PhDs, and also Masters does tend to be declining somewhat. So that might be something you want to talk about, but I am going to focus a little bit in on PhDs. So really, the PhD started off way back as a degree which is training people and preparing them for research and academia, really focused in on that side of things. In the 20th century, it started to change, and I think it started to transition into our current status today, which I think is experiencing an enormous amount of change, and there's change coming from all different directions. So that changing context of the PhD graduate was really around the fact that we were starting to train more and more PhDs, and a lot of them were not ending up in academic roles. In fact, a lot of them were not even ending up in research roles. So I think that changing context started to really make people think about how we are training PhDs today, and is it still a relevant degree for today's world? So that's where we sit now. We sit now with an explosion of new PhD models coming up all around the world, and different groups trying different things. And certainly internationally, the same sorts of things are being experienced. And the value-added part of the PhD is a subject of some debate. So I'll talk to some of these issues as we go through, but I just wanted to set the scene. So one exercise I did at UNSW was I contacted a lot of our heads of schools in different schools and faculties, so different disciplines. And I asked them one very simple question. That's the question at the top. Why do we train PhDs? So you might be thinking about that yourself. What I found was I got back reams and reams of answers. It was absolutely one of the most enthusiastic responses I've ever got from a straw poll type survey. I'm not claiming any academic rigorousness to this survey, but when I did a bit of a thematic analysis on the results that came back, really I would have to say that the fairly expected answers that came back were, number one, for the graduate, so obviously, training future leaders, maintaining the profession, providing graduates with skills and employment, obviously, learning research skills through conducting research and publication, etc., etc. For the university, so it was recognised in many cases that there was some level of having PhDs as part of your research workforce. So this was saying things, basically the responses around this were saying contributing to research outputs, making the university more competitive, contributing to teaching, certainly came up a few times, enriching and expanding the research environment, etc. So that was for the university. And then there was certainly a lot of recognition that we are also training PhDs for the global employment market, for the whole world, developing world-class universities, making our country much more competitive, meeting global demand, etc. So all of these things are things that are going around our supervisors and our heads of schools' minds. So it's quite varied when you think about it. It's certainly, there was differences between different disciplines. So there tended to be certain disciplines that really looked more towards the driving research outputs, and there was some that went much more to regenerating the profession. So it was quite interesting to see that. And this, I think, reflects the questions that are going on in many people's heads currently. So I think if you want to just summarise that, you can look at it as a virtuous cycle. So you can look at it from the perspective of we're starting off from a position where we want to have a positive impact on quality, quantity of outputs, And those outputs include our staff and our graduates, our student graduates. And we probably also are very interested in increasing our world rankings and our reputation. And I think that is driven very much by the quality of what we do. We then also want to attract high quality staff and students, and by attracting those we're able to support an enriched research environment, which then increases our block grant funding, our grant funding, etc. So this is the virtuous cycle. I think that we need to remember to argue to our leaders in the universities to place graduate research and research training firmly at the core of what we do. I think a lot of times it does tend to lose profile within universities. And I think many universities focus in on the income rather than developing our researchers as a real output and a real value that we're adding. So definitely, this is an argument that we can work on with our academic leaders and our leaders of our universities. But really, I think in our heart of hearts, what we're doing is we're actually focused on building these globally focused research leaders. And whether they're research leaders who go into the academic institutions or whether they're research leaders who understand the process of generating knowledge and can go into other professions, I think is the subject of the change that we're going through today. So to segue from really a bit of a reflection on the PhD, and this marvellous picture is one I took at in China. This is a face-changing dance. I'm not sure if you've seen the Sichuan opera with the face-changing dance. So this is really to illustrate, I guess, international context is important, and the fact that we're going through enormous change is also important. And those are things I'm just going to go through very briefly in the following slides. So first of all, international context. I think we would all agree that across the world, the predominant destination of the PhD is no longer in our academic institutions. There are many statistics out there. I think the worst case is one of the Royal Society stats, which says I think something less than 1% end up in tenured positions. When we've done surveys in Australia, we come out at roughly 50% at the 10-year point are still associated with an academic institution. Not in a tenured position, not necessarily in an academic position, but still associated with higher education. So that's still a pretty high percentage, but it is recognising that the other 50% are somewhere else. The expectations of employers from those different sectors have shifted, and have shifted quite a lot. And some of the things you can reflect on is the big push on corporate boards for gender balance. I mean, that's one driver that's out there in the corporate world that they're making much greater strides on and better strides on than we are in academic institutions. I think also professional development. That's something that our corporate brothers and sisters out there are probably much more across than we are in education institutions, which is scary. But I think change has begun across the sector. It's well and truly begun. And I think we're seeing that when we go to a lot of our international partners groups outside Australia. And I'll talk a little bit and point out a couple of those at the very end that are really useful for you to look at to see what they're doing, the sorts of things that are concerning them, and the publications that they're putting out. So in terms of nationally, our PhD, what does it look like? Currently, it's still primarily unstructured. There's a lot of moves there. Would you believe I made this slide in 2010? You know, when you're making these, you do a PowerPoint and you always sort of think, God, what have I got in my armament of PowerPoints? And this was one that I was doing at the Changing PhD, and I did it back in 2010. And I think it probably largely still applies today, in the fact that it is primarily unstructured. It's focused on the core research, and I think that's something we want it to continue to focus on. There is some value-added content available. Typically it's not mandatory, typically not accredited, typically it's not really structured or consolidated, and it's not consistently accessed across different programs. And I think I could expand that out and say it's not consistent across institutions in Australia. We're very, very inconsistent with how we've changed our PhDs. And finally, one thing that you'll all be probably familiar with is timely completion is something that we're all concerned with and that we're all focused on. And this is quite different from some of our international comparators. So those are just some points on national context. I want to talk a little bit about drivers of change, and I'll start with some national drivers. I want to just touch very, very incredibly briefly on global expectations. And then finally, just some political considerations. So first of all, and if I spoke to each of these, I could probably spend about 3 hours with you, so I'm not going to spend 3 hours. These are some of the national drivers of change that are occurring. And you should be familiar with all of these, if not now, after today. You should be very familiar with these. The ECOLA review is something which has produced a wonderful report. I've got a link to that report in this PowerPoint, and you will get a copy of the PowerPoint. But the ECOLA review was a review of the research training system, and I'd say it came out with something like 11 findings and 6 recommendations. The recommendations were to government, and most of those, I would say, have been ticked off partially or fully. So the government seems to have taken them on board and said, right, we're doing that, or we've done that, and they're being ticked off. 2 of those 6 recommendations relate to industry linkage and industry engagement. And that leads to the next point after Research Block Grant, which is the National Innovation Science Agenda, which is also driving us down this industry linkage pathway. The Research Block Grants themselves, the drivers in those are much more heavily emphasising Category 2 to 4 funding as opposed to previously when Cat 1 was emphasised. So that again is driving collaboration, driving industry linkages, driving international linkages. Our higher education standards have been revamped, republished. There's a whole beautiful new set of higher education standards, and we're all being audited by TEXA. And that's certainly a driver of our structures and making sure that we're matching and meeting and exceeding quality standards. And I think finally, the final one is the impact agenda. And again, that comes back to, are we engaging with end users, and how are we engaging with end users? And that again brings in that industry flavour. And I think although the National Innovation Science Agenda focuses very much on industry in the STEM areas, and STEM comes up all the time, the impact agenda is much broader. And I think that what it's saying is that engaging with end users is something that we should all be doing across all disciplines. So these are big national drivers that are impacting on us when we're training the next research leaders. In terms of global expectations, the main thing I really wanted to focus on here, a lot of the drivers that are occurring in Australia are actually occurring similarly in terms of industry linkages, international collaboration, etc., in other countries. But some of the things that bedevil us in terms of the global expectations are the fact that the PhD is a global qualification. This is a qualification. We are not preparing for Australia. We're not preparing for our own institutions. We are preparing our graduates for all around the world, for every country in the world. And just looking at UK, Europe, USA and Asia, the expectations for entry into a PhD and for the PhD itself are quite different. So there are very different expectations across different countries that we need to grapple with and we need to understand. And finally, the third thing I really wanted to talk about was political pressures. We have been beset with visa challenges over the past couple of years, and particularly last year, and you would have seen this in the news. And these tend to hit some of our largest cohorts, and in particular our cohort from China. So these are things that we as graduate leaders have had to lobby very heavily on, and the Australian Council for Graduate Research has also lobbied very heavily on this to work with the government to try to change some of those visa challenges. Now, that's just getting PhDs or HDRs into the country. Then we have the issue of early career researchers with the 457 visa issues, so the employment post-PhD. And again, we've had to lobby very hard with the government to try to make sure that they're putting in place sensible policy which isn't going to impact what is a global community. I think higher education reform, there has certainly been a lot of scare tactics, and now we're in a relatively stable situation where we don't think there is going to be fees introduced for higher degree research at this stage, and we hope that stays. But that certainly was a fear 2 years ago, and we've been sitting under that sort of cloud for a little while until just recently it was removed by Simon Birmingham. So there are still, I think, challenges there. I think things happening in the UK, Brexit certainly is challenging us. The USA travel bans and all of that work is challenging us. Some of it may be good, but I think, in terms of there may be a flow of candidates to us, and we may rub our hands together and say, oh, great. But on the other hand, we are part of this global community, and I think we do have to speak out sometimes about some of these things that are happening. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other aspects that keep popping up, particularly in Australia, that we have to think about: defence trade controls, sanctions, etc., that we need to comply with. So it's a complex role. There's many, many different factors we have to take into consideration. And I think I've just tried to touch very briefly on a few of those. Some of the things that I think my deans, my colleagues who are currently deans have been working on is looking at qualifications in and entry pathways into the PhD, coursework in the PhD, oral examination, embedding industry and end user linkages, and career development aspects. So all of those are things that in ACGR we've been discussing and working on pretty heavily over the last couple of years. And finally, I think I'd just come back the full circle to my initial opening remarks on why do we train PhDs, and I think the answer is we train PhDs for the global research effort, but we also now are training PhDs for a global employment market. And I think we have to be conscious of all of those drivers, those national drivers, those international drivers, and how they're going to impact on our graduates and their standing in the world tomorrow. So I will leave you with these linkages, so these links that you can actually find out a little bit more information on some of these things I've spoken about.